Sweat dripped down the concrete walls as the crowd's shouts made the ground tremble. In the center of the clandestine arena, two men stared each other down, but these weren't ordinary fighters. One was a tattooed colossus, his torso glistening with oil and scars. The other, an old man in a worn cap, leaning on a wooden cane. No one understood what the old man was doing there. "He's going to die!" someone shouted amidst laughter, while others pulled out their cell phones to record what they thought would be a humiliating beating. But no one knew who Don Eliseo really was. For years, he had walked the streets like a ghost, solitary, quiet, invisible. They mistook him for weak, for washed up. But that night, in that arena dominated by criminals, Don Eliseo was about to prove that some battles aren't fought with fists, but with what one has lived through. What no one expected was that this old man had a past capable of chilling the blood of even the most feared MMA narco fighter, and when he finally spoke, it would change everything. In this video, you'll discover a story of honor, redemption, and silent strength. You'll see how a seemingly ordinary man was able to paralyze an entire cartel with just a look and a memory he never forgot. Stay until the end, because this story will leave you breathless. And if you believe respect is earned with invisible scars, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. The best stories are just beginning. The smell of sweat, beer, and dried blood hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Lights dangled low, flickering over a circular steel structure. The fight octagon, the clandestine arena hidden beneath an old gym on the outskirts of Culiacan, seethed with euphoria. Shouts, bets thrown into the air, plastic cups flying amidst laughter. The law of the strongest reigned undisguised. Amidst that noisy crowd, a man walked in silence, slowly as if time didn't rush him. He wore a grey cap pulled down to his eyebrows, an old leather jacket that seemed to have survived more than one war, and a cane that he dragged more out of habit than necessity. His steps made no noise, but his presence was dense, as if something invisible accompanied him. No one noticed that Don Eliseo had arrived. He sat in the last row in a metal chair with a twisted back. He didn't order a drink. He didn't speak to anyone. He just watched. His eyes, sunken but alive, fixed on the center of the octagon, where a young fighter had just been knocked out by a brutal knee strike. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," shouted the announcer, a thin guy in a shiny suit with a microphone in hand. "Get ready for the undefeated of 17 fights, the animal of the cage, the one and only, Cobra Renteria." The roar was immediate. The applause and whistles shook the walls. A burly man climbed into the ring, bare-chested, dark tattoos up to his neck. He walked with a wild confidence, as if nothing in the world could touch him. He raised his arms, greeted his people, and spat on the ground. He had a square jaw, a nose broken several times, and an empty look that knew no compassion. The audience adored him. Meanwhile, Eliseo barely blinked. His cane rested between his knees, and his hands were clasped together, as in a silent prayer. He watched every step of the fighter, as if looking for something beyond strength. "What's that old man doing here?" whispered one of the betters. "Did he come to see another novice get his bones broken?" "That guy shows up every now and then," replied another. "He sits there and doesn't talk to anyone. They say he's crazy." "Well, tonight he's going to have a good show," said a third, raising his beer. The next fight began. Cobra Renteria destroyed his opponent in less than 2 minutes. A hook to the liver and a spinning elbow were enough. The crowd went wild. Some threw bills into the ring. Others recorded with their cell phones. The announcer laughed, euphoric. That's when it happened. Cobra, soaked in sweat, looked around for his next prey. His gaze stopped on Eliseo. Not by chance. Something about that old man caught his attention. Maybe it was the calmness, or the way he looked at him without fear. "And you, Grandpa," he shouted from the ring, "want to try your luck?" The arena erupted in laughter. The announcer celebrated it as if it were a rehearsed joke. "We have a challenger, folks. The cane man wants to fight." Don Eliseo didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just looked at him, slowly, directly, with a firmness that silenced a couple of laughs. Cobra frowned. He didn't like the gesture. "Are you scared, old man?" he provoked. "Or have you lost your tongue?" And then what no one expected happened. Eliseo stood up. He set the cane aside, carefully folded his jacket, and left it on the back of the chair. His body, though marked by the years, showed an unusual rigidity. His back straightened. His steps were slow, but each one had a weight that didn't come from muscles but from somewhere else, something deeper. He walked towards the ring. And the murmur turned into silence. The silence in the arena was unnatural. Each step of Don Eliseo towards the ring felt like a note out of place in a violent symphony. No one spoke, but everyone watched him. The old man showed no fear, no arrogance, just a calmness that disconcerted even the most experienced. Cobra Renteria watched him from the center of the octagon, still panting from the previous fight. His mocking smile faded as Eliseo crossed the canvas. "Are you really going to get in?" he growled, tilting his head like a curious dog. "I don't want to be accused of killing a grandpa." The announcer, doubting whether to continue with the show or stop it, looked at the organizers in the crowd. One of them, a bald man in a dark suit, nodded with a twisted smile. "Let him," he said in a mocking tone. "Let the old man earn his epitaph." Eliseo didn't respond. He just stopped in front of the ropes and looked up. Cobra's tattoos were intimidating. He had skulls on his chest, a snake that wrapped around his neck, and the symbol of a well-known cartel engraved on his back, Los Lobos del Norte, the Wolves of the North. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a narco, and not just any narco. Cobra Renteria was the favorite of a criminal group that dominated part of the north of the country. The fights were just part of the show. In the back hallways of the arena, shady deals were closed, money was laundered, and the fate of more than one enemy was decided. Eliseo knew all that. He had known it from the first moment he set foot in that place. Cobra spat to the side and approached, walking with loose fists and broad shoulders. "And what's your name, old man?" he asked, now more curious than mocking. Eliseo looked him straight in the eyes and replied in a firm voice, "Eliseo Ramirez." The name at first caused no reaction, but a few seconds later, a murmur began to grow among the older men in the place. One of them, with a thick mustache and denim jacket, leaned towards another and asked in a low voice, "Did he say Eliseo Ramirez?" "Yes." "Does it ring a bell?" The man paled. "That name, I heard it in the 90s, a guy who worked for the feds, but he disappeared." In the ring, Cobra didn't seem impressed. "It doesn't matter who you were, old man," he said in a threatening tone. "Here and now it's just you and me, and I have no mercy." The announcer, seeing that the tension was rising and people were starting to record, took the opportunity to announce the improvised match. "Attention, ladies and gentlemen. It seems we have a special fight tonight, Cobra Renteria versus Don Eliseo." I bet 1,000 that the old man won't last a round. The crowd, which had been confused, now roared with excitement. The promise of violence, though unfair, was an irresistible spectacle. Bets flew. Some shouted that it was suicide. Others just wanted to see blood. Eliseo entered the ring. His movements were measured, almost ceremonial. He didn't adopt a fighting stance. He just raised his fists with an old-fashioned elegance, as if coming out of an old boxing school. Cobra mocked the guard. "Seriously? You're coming with that? What is this, 1950? The improvised bell rang, a dry blow on a metal bar, and the fight began. Cobra lunged like a bull. A right hand cut through the air where Eliseo was, a second before. The old man had moved barely, dodging effortlessly. Then another blow and another. Nothing touched him. His body seemed to anticipate every movement of the narco. The crowd went silent. The announcer swallowed saliva. Eliseo didn't counterattack. He just dodged, read, studied, as if he was waiting for something, as if he knew that wasn't the moment. And as he did so, Cobra's eyes, once confident, began to fill with doubt. Don Eliseo's movements were so clean and precise that more than one in the crowd stopped recording to simply observe. It wasn't about luck or reflexes. It was experience. It was body reading. Each of Cobra's steps was anticipated with an economy of energy that only someone with real training and years of combat could execute. Eliseo didn't need to hit yet. He just watched. Cobra, frustrated, began to lose his rhythm. He threw a spinning kick that would have knocked anyone else down, but Eliseo dodged it as if dancing. The old man wasn't even panting. The arena was filled with a strange murmur, a mixture of surprise, respect, and confusion. Eliseo took a step back, and in doing so his eyes traveled to the past. Years ago, in a dark room of a barracks on the border, a young Eliseo was hitting a punching bag. He had a serious, concentrated face. Next to him, an instructor watched him. "It's not about strength, Ramirez," said the man, a former soldier with a hard look. "It's about knowing when and where. A true warrior fights with his head, not with his fists." Eliseo had understood it. And over the years, he became a shadow among criminal groups. They knew him as El Silencio, the silence, because he never spoke, because he never failed. But something happened, something that took him away from everything. An operation went wrong, an ambush, crossfire, screams, and among the rubble, the face of his son. He was 8 years old. He was there because Eliseo, in his obsession to protect the country, had forgotten to protect his home. And that day, he lost him. Since then, he disappeared. No one heard from him again, neither the authorities nor the cartels. He went out like a broken candle. Some thought he was dead, others that he had lost his mind. But he just walked away from the noise and the pain. Now facing Cobra, each of his movements was also an act of redemption. He wasn't just dodging blows, he was dodging the past. He was proving, in silence, that he could still control his own story. The crowd, seeing that the old man was still standing without a single scratch, began to change its attitude. They no longer laughed. They no longer shouted for blood. Many watched in silence, fascinated. Cobra, sweating more than usual, retreated for the first time. "Who the hell are you?" he asked through clenched teeth, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. Eliseo didn't respond. In the stands, the man in the denim jacket spoke again in a low voice, almost with reverence. "It's him. I swear it's him. The one from the border. The one who took down Commander Cardenas without firing a bullet. That old man is a legend." "Then why is he here?" asked his partner. "That's what I want to know," he whispered, "because if that man came back, it's for something big." In the ring, Cobra decided that was enough. He feigned an opening in his guard, hoping that Eliseo would attack. But the old man didn't fall into the trap. He stood firm like a rock. Cobra grunted, frustrated. He threw a series of wilder blows without technique, without control. And then, finally, Eliseo responded. A single movement, a slight twist of the waist, a short, dry blow, straight to the solar plexus. Cobra's body doubled over by reflex. It wasn't a big impact, but it disconnected him from the inside. Eliseo didn't take advantage. He didn't kick the fallen. He didn't raise his arms. He just took a step back and waited. Cobra slowly straightened up, breathing with difficulty. For the first time in his career, he felt fear. And Don Eliseo, standing in front of him, seemed not to be there to win, but to show something that went beyond the blows. The murmur in the arena was a confused echo of disbelief. Some no longer knew whether to cheer, record, or remain silent. Cobra Renteria, the undefeated, the feared, had just received a single blow, just one, and he had tasted the flavor of panic. Don Eliseo remained still, like a stone statue, not a gesture of mockery, not a hint of pride, just that constant look that seemed to see beyond the flesh. Cobra took 2 steps back, trying to regain his breath and dignity. Then, to everyone's surprise, he raised his hand. "Enough!" he shouted, panting. "This old man isn't a fighter. He's a trick, a trap." The announcer ran to the edge of the ring with the microphone trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that Cobra Renteria doesn't want to continue with the fight. What do you think?" The audience booed. Some demanded the return of their bets. Others just shouted out of rage or disappointment. The tension skyrocketed. But Cobra wasn't one to be humiliated without revenge. "You know what, Eliseo?" he said as he walked towards him, pointing at him with his finger. "If you want respect, you're going to have to earn it for real. I want a real fight." But this time, with a bet on the line, Eliseo didn't react. "What kind of bet?" asked the announcer, smelling gold in the provocation. Cobra smiled, but it was a dirty smile. "If I win, this old man kneels in front of the entire arena and begs me for forgiveness like a dog." The audience erupted in shouts. Some applauded, others whistled. "And if by some miracle he beats me, I retire, here, tonight." The silence was immediate. It was a dangerous declaration. Cobra had dark businesses behind his image. His retirement would not only be a loss of pride, but a break with the bosses who bet on him. The announcer turned to Eliseo. "Don Eliseo, do you accept the challenge?" The old man slowly lowered his gaze. For an instant, the memory of his son appeared in his mind. His little face dirty with dust. His voice asking when Dad would come back. Coming back doesn't always mean returning to a place. Sometimes it's making a decision that burns. Eliseo nodded. "I accept." The arena roared. It was official. A second fight, with a bet that no one would have imagined minutes before. From the shadows, the man in the dark suit, The same one who had authorized the first fight approached the organizers. He muttered something in the ear of one of them. No one else heard, but something changed in the atmosphere, as if the air became denser. "Prepare it well," he said in a low voice. "This old man cannot win, under no circumstances." While the staff checked the octagon's condition for the second fight, Eliseo returned to his makeshift corner. He had no trainer, no towel, no water bottle, just his folded jacket and his cane on the floor. He sat for a moment and closed his eyes. Memory dragged him back once more. A hospital, a woman with a broken look, his wife. "Eliseo, I couldn't find him," she sobbed. "I searched all the shelters. I asked the neighbors. They say he was taken." That night, Eliseo had made a decision to leave everything behind. Now, in this arena of criminals and bets, he understood that this fight wasn't for him. It was about closing a cycle, about looking the past in the eye and not bowing his head. On the other side, Cobra prepared like a fighting bull. One of his assistants rubbed oil on his arms, another checked his bandages. They spoke in his ear. They reminded him that this wasn't just a fight, it was a demonstration of power to his own. "Make him bleed," they said. "Let no one forget who's in charge." Cobra nodded. The bell would ring again soon, and this time it wasn't just a fight, it was a blood bet. The announcement of the second fight spread like wildfire through the arena's underground corridors. It wasn't common for an underground event to have a second act, much less with an old man as the protagonist. However, something in the atmosphere had changed. What was once mockery was now a dense mix of respect, intrigue, and fear. In one of the back corridors, a man with grey hair and a linen shirt stopped in front of a small screen showing the arena live. His expression froze when he saw Don Eliseo's face. It can't be. It was Ramiro, Eliseo's former partner in the darkest years of the fight against drug trafficking. He had left the life of an operative many years ago and now worked as security for the same people he once pursued. He lived with guilt, but also with secrets. "What's wrong, Ramiro?" asked a young man accompanying him. Ramiro didn't answer. He moved closer to the screen as if he needed to confirm that his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. That man, I thought he was dead. In his mind, the images were clear. Eliseo crossing the border with a shotgun on his back, Eliseo entering alone a property taken by hitmen and leaving with evidence that dismantled an entire network. Eliseo confronting Commander Cardenas, a monster in uniform, and forcing him to resign with just a closed-door conversation. And then, his disappearance, without a trace, without a burial, just silence. Ramiro swallowed hard. "If Eliseo came back," he murmured, "it's because there are scores that haven't been settled yet." In the arena, the audience began to divide. The younger ones still shouted for Cobra, confident in his brute strength. But the old ones, those who could read something more in a fight, as were uneasy. One of them, a retired mechanic, spoke in a trembling voice. "That man doesn't fight for ego. He doesn't do it for fame. That look, I saw it in the war. When you fight because you have nothing else to lose." Another, his face furrowed with scars, clenched his teeth. "We shouldn't be here. If this man is who I think he is, this isn't going to end well for anyone." Meanwhile, Cobra Renteria didn't stop warming up. He punched the air with fury, kicked the cushions his assistants offered him, but something in his energy had changed. He was no longer the confident rooster from the beginning. It was as if his body knew something that his mind hadn't yet accepted. "Why doesn't anyone just finish off that old man?" he asked, annoyed. One of his men hesitated before speaking. "They say he's a legend, boss. That in his time he scared even the generals." Cobra snorted, irritated. "Legends die just like everyone else." But his laugh lacked strength. In a corner of the arena, Eliseo remained alone. No one approached, not to mock him, not to encourage him. It was as if his presence generated a bubble of silence, a zone of involuntary respect. Only the slight cracking of his knuckles could be heard as he calmly closed his fists. Ramiro, now among the audience, made his way to the edge of the octagon. His gaze met Eliseo's. There was no hatred. There was no joy, just a silent recognition. Like two ghosts greeting each other on an abandoned battlefield, Eliseo said nothing. He just lowered his head slightly. Ramiro pursed his lips. "I told you the past would catch up with us someday," he whispered, and he disappeared back into the crowd. The lights began to flicker. The announcer climbed into the ring, euphoric about the tense atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, The most anticipated fight is about to begin. Cobra Renteria against the man who defied time and death, Eliseo Ramirez. The people roared, but it was no longer empty euphoria. It was a raw mix of fear and excitement, because those who knew him fear his return. The lights went out completely. Only 2 spotlights remained oscillating above the octagon, as if the entire universe had been reduced to that small metal quadrilateral. The crowd held its breath when the makeshift bell rang, a dry hit of pipe against bar. The second fight was about to begin. Eliseo got up without haste. He put his folded jacket back on the chair, took a long breath, and entered the ring. This time there were no doubts. He knew why he was there, and what was at stake went far beyond a victory or a defeat. It was a reckoning with life itself. Cobra Renteria, for his part, was already in the center of the ring. His eyes shone with contained fury. He looked like a trapped animal, a beast that couldn't stand the idea of being humiliated. The warnings from his assistants, the rumors running like poison through the arena, didn't matter. He only had one goal: to destroy. "Now we'll see, old man," he growled, rolling his shoulders. "There's no escape." Eliseo didn't answer. He simply raised his fists. This time his guard was different. It was no longer purely defensive. There was intention. A new energy was drawn in his posture, serenity in the body, but alertness in the eyes. The fight began. Cobra attacked immediately. His blows were bursts, a mix of MMA technique and street brutality. Low kicks, elbows, grapple attempts, but Eliseo was a shadow, not because of speed, but because of precision. Each dodge was minimal but sufficient. Each step back was calculated to the millimeter. The audience leaned forward, hypnotized by the asymmetrical dance happening in front of them. But then, something changed. One of Cobra's assistants from the corner gave a quick glance towards the man in the dark suit in the stands. The gesture was almost imperceptible. The boss nodded. At that moment, Cobra made a feint he hadn't used since his beginnings, a low sweep that wasn't in his usual style. Eliseo, for a fraction of a second, hesitated. And that hesitation was enough for Cobra to make contact. A knee to the side that made the old man's ribs crack. The blow wasn't accidental. It was precise, cold. Eliseo took 3 steps back. For the first time, his breathing quickened. In the stands, Ramiro noticed it instantly. "He hit him in the ribs," he whispered, worried. They already knew how to get to him. The man in the dark suit smiled. "Nothing is accidental," he murmured. Eliseo, staggering, raised his arms again. He didn't give up. He didn't fall. But his body already showed signs of wear and tear. Cobra noticed and changed his strategy. He was no longer looking to impress. Now, he was looking to break him, piece by piece. "Where's your legend now, old man?" he spat, throwing another hook to the torso. Eliseo dodged it, but with effort. Each movement cost him more. The ribs hurt. He felt the burning spread with each breath. He couldn't afford another mistake. That's when something broke inside him. A memory. The face of his son, running towards him in a dry field, with a wooden airplane in his hand, the sound of laughter, and then the explosion. It wasn't the physical pain that burned him now. It was the debt, the absence, the silence accumulated over the years. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, something had changed. His movements became shorter, faster. He no longer dodged with big steps, but with torso inclinations, with maneuvers he used when he was young. His body responded to the pain with muscle memory, as if each fiber remembered who he had been. Cobra, surprised, received 2 blocks in a row and a dry counter-strike to the shoulder. Nothing devastating but clear. The old man was still fighting, and he wasn't alone. He was fighting with the ghosts, with the past, with the guilt, and with everything the caged beast had taken from him. Eliseo breathed with difficulty. Each inhalation was an invisible cut that reminded him that he was no longer 20 years old, but his eyes remained firm. And that, more than any blow, worried Cobra. The narco fighter tried another direct attack, a leg grab, seeking to take the old man to the ground. But Eliseo turned his torso with precision, lowered his center of gravity, and freed himself with a hip movement. It wasn't a fast reaction. It was exact, efficient, as if each action was already premeditated. Cobra stepped back, puffing with frustration. "Damn it, who trained you?" Eliseo didn't answer. He just lowered his guard a little, just enough to attract a carelessness. Cobra fell into the trap. He threw a straight punch, and Eliseo deflected it with his left forearm. Then, like an echo of his glory days, he struck with an open palm to the chest. A single impact, not strong, but symbolic. Cobra stepped back, and the audience noticed it. "He's handling him," someone shouted. "The old man is controlling him with his mind." The adrenaline in the arena was palpable. The bets began to change direction. Some collected their bills. Others looked at Cobra with suspicion. Don Eliseo slowly turned his head and looked at the dark sector of the stands where the man in the suit was sitting. Their eyes met for a second. There were no threats, no gestures, just a silent message. "I know who you are." On the other side, Ramiro watched in silence, remembering the training they shared in their youth. Eliseo was different. He didn't fight for show, nor for ego, nor for blood. He fought for code. A philosophy he learned in the bowels of real combat. Never attack if it is not necessary. Never dirty the conscience with revenge. Defend, protect, contain. That was the warrior's code. And although the world had forgotten it, Eliseo had not. Inside the ring, Cobra was beginning to show cracks. His energy was no longer explosive. His arms hung lower. His breathing was disordered. Fear, that silent beast, was beginning to whisper in his ear. "Who the hell are you, old man?" he spat, sweat pouring down his forehead. Eliseo approached slowly, without raising his fists. "It doesn't matter who I was. What matters is what you are." His voice was low but clear. An empty man believing that hitting gives you power. Cobra roared and launched a knee to the stomach. Eliseo blocked it with his forearm and turned on his axis. The movement was so elegant that it elicited a shout of surprise from the audience. "That was Aikido," someone shouted. "Where did this guy come from?" Eliseo stood firm, but within himself he knew that his body wouldn't last much longer. The ribs hurt. The legs burned. His muscles were tense, like ropes about to break. He had to end this. But not just anyway. He had to do it according to his code. He watched Cobra again. He no longer saw him as an enemy, but as a reflection of so many other lost young people he met in his days as an operative. Young people who confused fear with respect, who learned to be cruel because they never knew how to be strong. "You can still stop," said Eliseo. "This doesn't have to end like this." Cobra, wounded in his pride more than in his body, shouted and launched a combination of wild blows. Fists, elbows, kicks, all disordered, instinctive, desperate. And Eliseo dodged it all. Each blow was air. Each attempt was in vain. Until in the midst of the frenzy, Eliseo caught Cobra's right arm, turned, and projected him to the ground with a maneuver that seemed more an act of art than of violence. Cobra fell heavily, gasping. The old man stood, fist closed, but not using it. He didn't finish the fight, he didn't finish him off because his code didn't allow it, and the audience fell silent. Because for the first time, they were witnessing honor in a cage of blood. Cobra remained on the ground. His chest rose and fell violently, trying to capture the air that escaped him like sand between his fingers. He didn't understand how he had gotten there, how that old man, without having destroyed his face, had beaten him, not with blows, but with control. Don Eliseo didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't seek applause. He just took 2 steps back, enough to make it clear that there was no intention to humiliate. In his own way, he had already won, and he had also given a warning. The bell rang again, marking the end of the second round. The crowd didn't roar, there was no euphoria. What was breathed was something denser, more reverent, a mix of respect and fear. The assistants ran to Cobra to lift him up. His gaze was lost, not just because of fatigue. It was as if he had seen something that his mind couldn't comprehend. "What was that?" he murmured. Eliseo got out of the ring without help. He took his jacket with the same calm with which he had arrived and sat back down where it all began. No one dared to say a word to him. The men who had previously mocked him now avoided him with their eyes. A different aura enveloped him, a presence that imposed itself without the need for a voice. In the stands, Ramiro was still there. He no longer doubted. He no longer needed proof. That was the Eliseo he had known, the one who once faced an entire squad just to save a child, the one who disappeared when he understood that the price of his duty was higher than any medal. But Ramiro also knew something else. This was not over, and he confirmed it when he noticed that the man in the dark suit was no longer in his seat. "They're going to try," he murmured to himself. "They don't care about the outcome of the fight. They just don't want that man to get out alive. Meanwhile, Eliseo looked at the ground unblinking. He wasn't thinking about the fight, not even about Cobra. He was thinking about a letter, a yellowish sheet kept for years at the bottom of a Bible that he no longer opened. The handwriting was shaky, childish. "Dad, Mom says you went on a trip again. I waited for you last night with the little airplane. Do you remember the one we made together? I miss you. Do you promise you're going to come back?" Eliseo squeezed his eyes shut. Not to cry, to contain the storm brewing in his chest. He had stopped making promises a long time ago, but tonight he felt like maybe it was time to fulfill something, even if it was late. The host tried to lift the crowd's spirits with jokes and side bets, but the audience wasn't responding the same way. Something had broken. They had seen something different, something that didn't fit with the usual show. And in the back hallways, the atmosphere was getting murkier. "Are you sure?" one of the organizers asked. The man in the dark suit nodded, pulling out a phone. "It's not about the fight anymore. This guy knows too much. If he leaves this arena walking, he becomes a symbol. And we can't allow that." On the other end of the line, a voice responded firmly, "Then he doesn't leave." They hung up. In the technical area, the cameras began to shut down one by one. Some assistants were replaced by others who weren't wearing uniforms. At the main entrance, two men discreetly closed the metal gates. Ramiro saw everything, and he knew he had to act. He pulled out his cell phone, but there was no signal. He ran towards one of the side hallways and looked for an emergency exit. Every step was more urgent. It wasn't just for Eliseo anymore, it was for the weight of history, for what he represented. And in the middle of that dense silence that floats before a catastrophe, Eliseo looked up. He felt it. The storm was coming. And it wouldn't be inside the ring. The arena lights dimmed until they were almost completely off. A single spotlight turned on above the octagon, bathing it in a dirty, dramatic white. The atmosphere was no longer one of spectacle, it was one of execution. Don Eliseo stood up again. His ribs ached like embers under his skin. His legs felt heavy, but his mind was as clear as ever. He knew something else was moving in the shadows. He felt it in the murmurs that weren't from the audience, in the eyes of the new assistants, in the way the doors no longer opened. It was an ambush, and the fight wasn't over yet. "We have a final round!" the host shouted in a voice that sounded forced, tense. "One more chance to prove who's in charge in this arena." Cobra Renteria was already standing again. Although battered, his face had changed. He was no longer the professional fighter. He was the trained hitman, the one who follows orders. And this time, the orders were clear. Finish off the old man. He approached the center of the ring with clenched fists and gritted teeth. Eliseo saw him coming. "You're not fighting for yourself anymore," he said softly. "Now you're just a dog on a leash." Cobra didn't respond. He just attacked, and the impact was brutal. Eliseo took the first blow directly to the stomach. He hunched over, then an elbow to the back. He fell to his knees. The audience gasped. Some screamed, others covered their mouths. This no longer looked like a fair fight. It was an execution disguised as combat. Ramiro burst into one of the side hallways, trying to stop the fight. But two men blocked him. They were part of the undercover operation. They pushed him against the wall and punched him in the stomach, leaving him breathless. "Stay out of it," they whispered. In the ring, Cobra lifted Eliseo by the jacket and held him in the air. "They said you were a legend," he spat in his face. "But to me, you're just old dust." And he threw a punch that resonated like thunder. Eliseo fell. His body hit the canvas. The cane rolled out of the ring. Some thought he was dead, but no. Eliseo slowly moved one arm, then the other, and against all odds, he got up again. He was shaking. He was bleeding from his forehead. His chest rose and fell like a broken bellows. But his eyes were still there, like beacons in the fog. There was no defeat in his gaze, only conviction. "I don't kneel," he said, spitting blood. "Never again." The audience held its breath. Cobra stopped for a second. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. How could this man still be standing? What was keeping him alive? Then Eliseo took a step forward, and another. He raised his fists. No longer with technique or with speed. He was doing it for something deeper, for all those who couldn't, for all those who were silenced, for his son. The final confrontation began. Cobra attacked with everything, knees, shoves, elbows. But this time, Eliseo didn't back down. Every blow received was returned with surgical precision, not by force but by point. One to the neck, another to the shoulder, a fist to the sternum. Cobra staggered. He defended himself with rage, but he lost his composure. The shouts in the arena became disordered. They no longer knew who to root for. What they were seeing was something that escaped the rules of the show. It was a lone man, fighting against an entire system, and resisting. A final kick made Cobra stumble. Eliseo caught him with a grip that seemed impossible for his age. He turned him and pushed him against the ropes. The canvas vibrated. Cobra's eyes widened with fear. Eliseo held him by the neck, staring at him. "You are not the enemy. You are the product of the real enemy." And he let him go. Cobra fell to the ground, but it wasn't over, because something was still going to break. Cobra fell to his knees. His arms hung down. His breathing was an animal pant, and blood ran down his right eyebrow. The audience fell silent, frozen. For the first time, the undefeated seemed defeated, not by force, but by something more devastating. Involuntary respect. The kind that is born when you recognize that the other has something that you never understood. Eliseo was still standing. His body trembled, sustained by willpower, but his gaze was firmer than ever. There was no hatred. There was no thirst for revenge. Only truth. And that truth was a burden he was about to release. "Get up," he said in a deep voice. "I'm not done with you." Cobra looked at him from the ground, confused. "You want to kill me?" he spat. Eliseo shook his head. "I want you to listen." From a corner, a crash cut through the atmosphere. The metal access gate opened violently and a group of armed men began to advance. They were hooded, professionals. The operation that the bosses had prepared in case Eliseo came out alive. The audience began to scream. Some ran. Others were paralyzed. The screams mixed with the metallic hum of fear. Ramiro, with his face bloody, managed to break free from his captors and shouted from the stands, "Eliseo, they're coming for you." Cobra turned and saw them too. What the hell? And then everything froze for a second. Eliseo lowered his arms. He looked at Cobra, looked at the armed men who already surrounded the ring, and then raised his voice with an authority that made even the air stop. "This man is not to blame," he roared. "I'm the one they want to silence because I know what they do, because I saw what they hide, because I exposed them 20 years ago and they thought I was dead." The silence was sepulchral. The hooded men stopped. Eliseo pulled a small object wrapped in tape from his boot, a worn USB drive. "Everything is here," he shouted. "Names, dates, figures. The corrupt system, the money laundering, those who control the fights, the politicians, the cartels, everything." The host fell to his knees, as if he had just understood the weight of what he was witnessing. Eliseo looked at the armed men again. "If you kill me here, this is going to leak. I have everything replicated. There are copies all over the country." Cobra watched him in shock. For the first time, he didn't know which side he was on. "Is that why you came back?" he asked, almost without a voice. "I came back because they took everything from me," Eliseo replied. "My family, my name, my peace. But they couldn't take the truth from me." One of the hooded men looked at another, hesitating. The protocol said shoot, but something in the atmosphere was stronger than the orders. The fear was no longer towards Eliseo. It was towards what he represented. The man in the dark suit, who was now nervous at one of the exits, pulled out his cell phone to give the final order, but it was too late. Ramiro, from above, threw a small package into the ring. Eliseo caught it in flight. It was a wireless microphone connected to an open signal. Eliseo turned it on and spoke. "My name is Eliseo Ramirez. I was part of an operation that uncovered the dirtiest network in this country. They silenced me, they erased me, but they didn't kill me. Today, I return with evidence." His voice was projected beyond the arena. Outside, someone was broadcasting live. Dozens of cell phones were recording him. The message was already unstoppable. Cobra stood up, staggering. "What now?" he asked. Eliseo looked at him, breathing with difficulty. "Now you decide what you're going to be when this is over. If you're going to continue being a puppet or a free man." And then the turn was complete. Cobra, with bloodshot eyes, looked at the hooded men. He turned and stood on Eliseo's side. The audience erupted. The man in the dark suit fled through a side exit. Several of his men followed him. The operation disintegrated. The hooded men lowered their weapons, and in the middle of the ring, two men marked by violence had chosen honor. The sun was already beginning to rise when Eliseo crossed the back door of the arena. His body ached in every corner, but his spirit was lighter than ever. Behind him was the echo of an impossible night. A night in which blood was not shed to win, but truth. Ramiro was waiting for him next to an old car. "There are still people who believe, huh?" he said with a wounded smile. Eliseo nodded and looked at the horizon. Sometimes just one is enough to wake up the others. Cobra Renteria, for his part, did not return to the ring. He abandoned the cage, the cartel, and the violence. He opened a gym in a forgotten neighborhood, where he taught self-defense and, for the first time, respect. The USB drive that Eliseo delivered went through news, social networks, and courts. Several powerful names fell, others fled. But the country did not forget that the truth, when spoken with courage, resounds louder than gunshots, and of Eliseo, little else was known. Some say he disappeared again. Others swear they have seen him in churches, markets, fields, like a good shadow that watches from afar. But those who were there that night, those who saw him standing in front of a beast with only his principles, know that the legend was not a story. He was a man, a warrior, a father who chose to fight for something bigger than himself. If this story touched your heart, if you ever felt that the truth had no strength, remember Eliseo Ramirez. And don't forget, honor doesn't die. It just waits in silence. Subscribe for more stories like this. Share, comment, and keep the flame alive. Because sometimes what remains standing is not the muscles but the principles.